Before the United States entered the Second World War, a group of courageous American pilots known as the Flying Tigers took on the overwhelming might of the Imperial Japanese Air Force. These high-flying soldiers of fortune raked through the skies of the Far East, helping to stop Japan's march across China. Their fame soon spread, and tales of their exploits read like something out of an adventure novel. Using state-of-the-art computer graphics, we put you in the cockpit of the dogged American P-40 Tomahawk as it takes on the agile Japanese Ki-27 Nate. Experience the battle and examine the tactics as we reenact the dogfights. On the 20th of December 1941, 10 Japanese twin-engined Ki-21 Sally bombers flew towards the southern Chinese city of Kunming. As they neared their target, the bomber pilots were stunned to see 4 small fighter aircraft bearing down on them. The approaching P-40 Tomahawks opened fire. Caught off guard, the Sallies quickly jettisoned their bomb load and turned full throttle toward home. But 10 more of the camouflaged fighters appeared. The fighters were unlike any aircraft the Japanese had ever encountered. They were fast and expertly flown. Their wings bore the national markings of the Chinese Air Force, but their nose sported the gaping maw of a great shark. It was the Flying Tigers, in their first mission over Southeast Asia. Raining deadly tracer on the twin-engined aircraft, a fighter barely missed slamming into one of the Sallies, and at the last second, slid beneath it. The bomber burst into flames and nosed over in a death spiral. Four of the Japanese aircraft were blown out of the sky. Damaged, the 6 remaining Sallies limped back to their base.
That first combat on December 20th, 1941, represented a watershed in the history of military aviation in China. This was the first time that a thoroughly modern, professional Air Force staffed by Americans engaged the Japanese on the Asian mainland, and it was a stunning success.
The Japanese didn't know who the mysterious aviators were. But the grateful Chinese did. And when a Chinese newspaper recounted the lopsided victory, they gave the brave pilots a name.
The Chinese paper had come up with the expression, "They're fighting like tigers, flying tigers."
The pilots were Americans, volunteers serving in the Chinese Air Force. They found themselves fighting for the Chinese because of a remarkable pilot named Claire Lee Chenault. An officer in the Army Air Corps in the 1930s, Chenault earned a reputation as an authority on fighter tactics and as a fearless pilot and an able leader. By the age of 40, he had commanded a fighter squadron and had toured the country as lead pilot of the Army's first aerobatic team. An adamant and vociferous advocate for more and better fighter aircraft, Chenault had stepped on one too many toes at Army headquarters. In 1937, he was asked to resign his officer's commission and retire. The following day, he accepted an offer from the Chinese.
In 1937, he was asked to go to China to do an evaluation of the Chinese Air Force. The Japanese had been carrying on their terror bombing campaign, and the little Chinese Air Force was being beaten and was eventually beaten badly.
In 1937, 2 years before the outbreak of the Second World War, the Japanese expanded their hold on Manchuria. The Chinese suffered terribly. Seaports were attacked, and natural resources were seized to feed the imperial war machine. Towns were bombed relentlessly as the Japanese adopted a terror policy called the 3 alls: kill all, loot all, burn all. With obsolete aircraft, the Chinese Air Force was no match for the efficient, modern, and brutal Japanese. But Claire Chenault had a solution.
The Chinese Air Force had been decimated, and it was important to keep China in the war. And the only way they could keep China in the war, they needed an instant Air Force. And the only way you're going to get an instant Air Force is to recruit professionals out of the Army, Navy, and Marine Corps. So Chenault came back to the States to make his case.
Early in 1941, the United States was not yet at war with Japan. If American airmen were to fight the Japanese, they would have to do it as members of the Chinese Air Force. Working with secret US government approval, Chenault put out the word that the Chinese were looking to hire qualified pilots and mechanics.
They were allowed to resign from the U.S. Armed Forces, turn around and sign a lucrative contract with the Chinese government.
The pay was very good. The lowest pay for a pilot was $600 a month. That's for a wingman. Then you had $650 for a flight leader, $750 for a squadron leader. So that was very attractive.
At nearly 3 times the usual salary of a military aviator, word of the generous offer spread quickly. It didn't take long to fill a roster with 99 eager pilots. Recruiters also hired about 200 enlisted aircraft mechanics, armorers, radio operators, administrators, and even a chaplain. By July 1941, the airmen had traveled to Kidao Airfield in Burma, an airbase borrowed from the British. It was strategically located 300 miles from Lashio, the last stop of the Burma Road, the main supply route into China.
The single biggest reason for the Flying Tiger's existence was to defend the Burma Road. That road, which ran, as the name implies, from Burma into southern China, was the major supply route for sustaining Chinese military operations against the Japanese in that part of the world.
At Kidao Airfield, they took possession of their new aircraft, the P-40, and a new official name, the American Volunteer Group, or AVG. Chenault divided his unit into 3 pursuit squadrons. Each had its own logo, but in the autumn of 1941, all the squadrons adopted the soon-to-be famous paint scheme for their Tomahawks. The menacing, grinning shark's mouth would become synonymous with the Flying Tigers.
We're looking at a publication that comes out of India, and it showed a lot of these Aussie airplanes, the P-40, just like we had. And it showed the shark's mouth on it. And it lends itself so well to that airplane that we adopted it.
By December 1941, the pilots of the AVG had been training in their P-40s for months, but had yet to test their skills. A few days before Christmas, they got their chance. On the 20th of December, they intercepted and destroyed 4 out of 10 Sally bombers before they struck Kunming, China. Three days later, they defeated another Japanese attack, claiming 11 confirmed kills and 5 probables. And on Christmas Day, they downed an astounding 24 Japanese aircraft. But those early actions were all defensive, stopping the incoming bombing raids. A few days after New Year, the Flying Tigers took the fight to the Japanese. On the 3rd of January 1942, pilot David Tex Hill was on his first mission for the Flying Tigers. Tex Hill had left the Navy to volunteer. He was eager for action. He and 3 other American pilots flew their P-40 Tomahawks toward the Japanese airfield at Rahing, Thailand. The plan? Arrive at dawn and decimate enemy aircraft on the ground.
Jack Newkirk, who was the squadron leader, and he had Bert Crispin on his wing, and Jim Howard leading the element, and I was on Jim's wing.
Shortly after takeoff, one of the P-40s radioed in.
Bert Crispin had engine trouble, so he had to turn back.
Crispin headed for home, and the 3 remaining P-40s continued on. They were over the target at first light. They made a left turn to align with the field and began a shallow dive. The pilots lined up one behind the other, about 950 feet apart, known as a string formation.
They would bend it over, which means to put your airplane in a dive, and accelerate as they came down to strafe the aircraft on the ground.
Their 1,200 horsepower Allison engines screamed as they dived towards the airfield at 300 miles per hour. Jim Howard strafed the area, raking the airfield with machine gun fire. Tex Hill dived after him, preparing his own strafing run. But the run was cut short when Tex saw a Ki-27 Nate at 10 o'clock, streaking in right onto Howard's tail. It was Tex Hill's first time in combat, and his friend's life was in his hands. January 3rd, 1942. The Flying Tigers take the fight to the Japanese and attack an airfield at Rahing, Thailand. Tex Hill's flight leader, Jim Howard, has just been attacked by a Japanese Nate. Jim Howard is here. The Nate is on his tail here. Tex is here. As Jim Howard strafed the airfield, the Nate opened fire on him. Tex closed in on the Nate's tail and lined him up in his crosshairs.
Our ammo was loaded with every 5th round was a tracer. So it looked like just a big hose, you know, going out there. So I just looking right through the windscreen and following those tracers, and it blew up right in front of me.
He blasted through the churning fireball. At the other end of the airfield, Jim Howard pulled up from his strafing run, intact. It was Tex's first victory. But there was no time to celebrate. Another Nate at 12 o'clock high was directly in front of him.
When I saw that other guy who was starting to make a pass on me, then I turned into him head on.
It was a defining moment for Tex, when he would demonstrate perfectly the strengths of the P-40 over the Japanese Nate. The P-40 was built by the Curtiss Aircraft Company in Buffalo, New York. Claire Chennault obtained 100 that were originally destined for the British Royal Air Force. The P-40B was rugged, could reach 378 miles per hour, and was heavily armed with 2 50 caliber nose-mounted machine guns and 4 wing-mounted 30 calibers. It also had thick armor around the engine and cockpit to protect the pilot. Its opponent was the Nakajima Ki-27 Nate, which entered service in 1936. The Nate had an air-cooled radial engine and fixed landing gear. Its top speed was 305 miles per hour, and it was armed with one 12.7mm and one 7.7mm nose-mounted machine gun. The P-40 had better firepower and armor, but it was heavy and couldn't match the turning ability of the much lighter Japanese Nate. These fundamental differences in aircraft design were the basis of Claire Chennault's approach to dogfighting.
And the type of attacks he typically set up was to come in at high altitude, make screaming diving attacks against Japanese formations, take the energy that they built up, zoom climb up to a high altitude again, and come back around. He told his pilots, do not dogfight with the Japanese airplanes. It was certain death.
Facing a Japanese Nate head-on, Tex Hill applied these tactics. He knew the way to dogfight with a Nate was not to dogfight at all. Instead, he would charge him with all guns blazing. Tex Hill is here. The Nate is here. Tex will pull up into the Nate, aim towards him, and attack him head-on.
I'm pulling into him, and of course I had the firepower on the head-on.
The fight is closed at over 600 miles per hour. The Nate peppered Tex's aircraft, but the P-40's armor plating did its job.
Eventually, the lighter armored Nate couldn't take the punishment and ended up spiraling out of control.
The Nate spiraled into the jungle. The fight was over.
I had no idea where Howard and Newkirk were. I just headed right home, get out of that area.
Suddenly, Tex felt an intense vibration. His aeroplane was shaking violently.
The instruments are probably just almost shaking out of the panel itself, and he's probably wondering if he's even going to make it back to base.
He finally reached Mingladong Airfield, where Howard and Newkirk had also landed safely, and checked over his aircraft.
He shot 33 holes in my airplane. Some of his bullets stuck in my prop, and it threw the prop out of balance, and I thought the engine was coming out of the airplane.
The Flying Tiger's first offensive mission against the Japanese was a success. 4 enemy fighters destroyed in the air and 4 bombers on the ground. They were also gaining notoriety. The Flying Tigers didn't use military ranks or military discipline. They fought and played by their own rules. Their raucous antics fueling their fame.
In Rangoon, they rode water buffalo down the street. They shot up the chandeliers in their favorite watering hole. They even had a pet leopard.
Chenault looked the other way, allowing the pilots to relieve the tension of constant combat. Chenault looked the other way, allowing the pilots to relieve the tension of constant combat. But he insisted on total discipline in the air.
I think he was an excellent leader. If you did your job right, why, he would back you at every time.
During its 6 months in combat, this handful of American soldiers of fortune claimed nearly 130 Japanese aircraft. 11 went down under the guns of Tex Hill's P-40 Tomahawk.
Here's a ragtag mercenary organization of former Army, Navy, Air Force officers and enlisted men who took on the Japanese head-to-head, very close to Japanese home islands, and proved that the enemy, who appeared to be 10 feet tall, could be whittled down to size.
But after Pearl Harbor, a mercenary force wasn't needed anymore. The full might of the US military had now been engaged. Despite their legendary combat record, the decision was made to allow the American Volunteer Group's contract with the Chinese government to expire on July the 4th, 1942. But the Flying Tigers would live on. The Army soon created the China Air Task Force to oversee the air war in the Far East. The mission and men of the AVG would be incorporated into the new unit as the 23rd Fighter Group. The China Air Task Force came under the control of a colorful commander named Joseph Vinegar Joe Stilwell.
The transition from the AVG to the China Air Task Force was somewhat messy. The pilots were being coerced to stay in the China Air Task Force, and it left a lot of bitter feelings.
Stilwell brought in General Clayton Bissell to talk to the AVG.
He could not have chosen a poorer man for the job. The Flying Tigers were gathered in an auditorium, And he basically laid it out. He said, we want you to stay. If you don't want to stay, then you can go home, but we will have draft boards waiting for you at the gangplank in the United States, and you'll be drafted into the Army as privates in the infantry.
The pilots didn't take well to Stilwell's intimidation and threatened to leave en masse. Claire Chennault reactivated his commission and was promoted to general. He set out to rescue the situation and preserve the fighting spirit that made the Flying Tigers famous. He called Tex Hill into his office.
And Chennault said, I think Bissell poisoned them. I don't think many of them are planning to stay. If I lose you, Tex, I'm not sure what I'm going to do. And Tex immediately said, General, I'll stay as long as you need me. Chennault was obviously relieved and asked Tex to kind of talk to some of the guys and see if they would stay on, because these were the veterans.
In the end, 26 out of 90 AVG pilots and 57 out of 190 ground crew extended their contracts for 2 weeks. Enough time to train the new recruits. Tex and Chennault persuaded 5 Flying Tiger pilots to stay on longer to fight with the new command. On the 29th of July 1942, the new Flying Tigers entered the fray. The Japanese mounted a concerted effort to wipe them out. Several nights in a row, waves of Japanese bombers pummeled the airstrip at Hengyang Airfield. Frustrated by the attacks, a soft-spoken, talented fighter pilot named John Allison approached Tex Hill.
I said to Tex, as the AVG tried to stop him at night, and if I remember correctly, he said, well, we made some attempts, but we were never very successful at it. So I said to Tex, well, if they come tomorrow, I'm going to be up there.
29th of July, 1942. A hunter's moon shone brightly over Hengyang Airfield. The Flying Tigers were on the prowl, and John Allison was to get his first taste of combat. Allison had been alerted that a Japanese bomber formation was en route to attack the Tigers' base. He strapped into his P-40 and launched into the air.
John Allison reminds me of no one as much as Jimmy Doolittle. They're both short in stature, very focused, precise types of aviation professionals, but when each of them climbed in the airplane, strapped in and started the engine, there was a personality change.
Tex Hill and John Allison had worked out a clever tactic to detect and engage the enemy formation. Previous raids had shown them that the Japanese liked to bomb targets from 15,000 feet.
We didn't want them to get underneath us because at night you just can't see them, although you could see the flame from their exhaust.
Allison and veteran AVG pilot Ajax Baumler would be flying in a position called Up Moon. Lacking radar or navigation aids, the moonlight was their only help in detecting the enemy. If the Japanese came in at their normal altitude, both pilots would see them silhouetted against the moonlit sky. If the Japanese came in under Allison, Baumler would see them. And if they came in under Baumler, they would be low enough for ground crew to spot them and radio ahead. Baumler leveled off at 9,000 feet. Allison continued on to circle at 12,000 feet. Somewhere in the darkness, the formation of 6 Japanese Ki-21 bombers approached in 2 3-plane units. The Mitsubishi Ki-21 bomber, better known to the Allies as the Sally, was the workhorse of the Japanese Army Air Force in China. It could carry over 2,000 pounds of bombs. The Sally had astonishing range, but this came at the cost of crew protection. It was very lightly armored. A fighter could shred the Sally with machine gun fire if he could get in close. But he would have to brave its 2 trainable 7.7mm machine guns, one in the nose and one in the tail. Allison received a radio call. Crew at the airbase could hear the Sally's engine somewhere above them.
Finally, they were approaching our little airport at Hengyang from the north.
Allison and Baumler scanned the skies, peering through the darkness for a glimpse of the bomber's exhausts. Allison twisted his head around and caught the flash of an exhaust. 3 Sallies were above him.
I was 3,000 feet below them. I immediately opened the throttle full power and started to climb, and I said, okay, fellows, watch the fireworks.
Allison targeted one of the 3 aircraft, but misjudged his closing speed.
My airplane was climbing fast and also going much faster than the bombers, and I turned to follow them, and I was right in the middle of the formation.
Suddenly, streams of tracer bracketed Allison's P-40.
They were shooting at me, and my radio went dead. They had hit my radio. This is before I'd fired a shot, and they'd put one round right through the seat and into my parachute.
His engine was peppered as he flew through the stream of bullets. Allison needed to act quickly. In order to reposition himself behind the bombers, he will rudder hard left and throttle down. It causes his aircraft to skid to the side and dramatically cuts his airspeed. The tactic works perfectly.
I probably wasn't 200 feet behind them, maybe even closer. And my first rounds are down the fuselage. And I know I must have killed everybody in the airplane.
The attack from point-blank range shredded the bomber. The damaged Sally pitched hard up, hemorrhaging oil which splattered onto Allison's windshield. The damaged Sally pitched hard up, hemorrhaging oil which splattered onto Allison's windshield. Allison has just knocked out one Sally, but there are 2 left. The formation's right wingman is the closest target, but its rear gunner has Allison in his crosshairs. Allison rolled right, swinging in onto the bomber's 6, braving a hail of tracer fire.
The one that had been hitting me on the right, hitting me most, I just gave him a burst and he exploded.
It was a confirmed kill. There was just one Sally left, the leader. Allison's P-40 was wounded, though, having taken a tremendous beating.
I didn't realize how hard I had been hit, but they'd actually knocked a 5-inch hole through the crankcase, and all the oil was draining out, which I didn't know that. Thanks to the P-40 and its ruggedness, it kept flying.
And there is nothing more dangerous than a wounded tiger. Allison broke left, throttled forward, and let rip on the lead Sally. His rounds pierced the aircraft's left engine. Trailing flaming debris, the Sally disappeared into the darkness. It was Allison's 3rd bomber. A good night's work. But with flames licking his engine cowling, it was time to head back to base and attempt an emergency landing.
When the airplane really started to burn, I kind of panicked, and I was going so fast I couldn't get into the airport. But fortunately, the river was right out ahead of me, and I said, oh, well, I can make the river.
Allison ditched his crippled P-40 in the Xiangqiang River.
I popped out of the airplane, swam over to a log raft. A Chinese young man ran out across the logs, pulled me up, and in my best Chinese, I was shouting, I'm an American, I'm an American.
4 of the 6 Japanese bombers sent to strike the airfield were shot down. But those 6 bombers were just the first wave. Only hours later, in the light of day, the Japanese would send a far larger formation to eliminate the Americans once and for all. And this time, they would bring an escort, a formation of fighters more advanced and more powerful than the Nate. These would test the Flying Tigers as never before. On the 30th of July, 1942, in southeast China, the 75th Fighter Squadron of the Flying Tigers was scrambled to intercept a formation of enemy aircraft sent to level their home base at Hengyang Airfield. Tex Hill led 10 P-40s into the fight. Hill climbed to meet the formation of 27 Japanese fighters that were leading the attack.
But then here comes this big fighter sweep.
Tex Hill is here. The formation of enemy fighters is here. Tex must climb to engage them. In true Flying Tiger style, he'll attack them head-on. As Tex reached 19,000 feet, he surveyed the Japanese formation. They weren't the familiar Nates. The fighters were a newer, more advanced Japanese aircraft. The Nakajima Ki-43 Oscar was the successor to the Nate and entered service in the Pacific in 1941. Like all Japanese fighters, it traded armor for performance. Powered by a 1,150 horsepower engine and armed with two 12.7mm machine guns, it could fly faster and higher than the Nate. And they were flown by skilled Japanese Army pilots. All through the 1930s, the Japanese developed their military air arm. Both naval and army aviators were highly skilled warriors of the Emperor.
The Japanese military culture was extremely mission-oriented. It was said that every Japanese warrior owed the Emperor his life. And if the mission called for sacrificing his life in advancing the cause of the Emperor, who many Japanese literally considered a living god, that was not only required, it was also deemed a significant honor.
Those guys were very well trained. I say, you know, the Japanese, anything that they did or set out to do, they just really excelled in it.
The Oscars spotted the P-40s and moved to engage. Tex opened his throttle, leading his group of P-40s to meet the Japanese assault head-on. It was this fearless tactic that had made the Flying Tigers famous. One of the Japanese Oscars pulled ahead of the rest and positioned to go head-to-head with Tex.
This guy and I came head-on, doing about 250 or something like that. He was doing around 200. That's pretty fast. But you know, you get a fixation on something like that. Sometimes with a closing rate like that, well, you could very easily collide.
Tex and the Oscar both opened fire at the same time. The P-40 shuddered as the Oscar's bullets hit home. Tex ignored them and kept on closing. He knew that his 6 machine guns were capable of doing more damage than the Oscar's 2 12.7mm guns.
The minute I hit him, he started smoking.
He immediately began to trail a thin trail of smoke, and we knew he was hit, and probably fatally.
The Oscar was an advanced Japanese fighter, but it still had the Nate's old weakness: no armor. A split second before certain collision, the Oscar burst into flames and veered away. Tex Hill's P-40s went on to down 15 enemy fighters in the raid. The Japanese attack failed, and the Flying Tiger's home airfield was saved. The Japanese effort was derailed by Chennault's well-honed tactics. Avoid a turning dogfight and use the P-40's superior speed, power, and heavy armament. The tactics that worked against the Nate were equally effective against the Oscar. The China Air Task Force went on the offensive, targeting Japanese military and industrial sites throughout Southeast Asia. On the 12th of August 1942, B-24 heavy bombers, supported by Flying Tiger P-40s, attacked the key shipping center at Haiphong, destroying ships, airfields, and vital supply dumps. In October, P-40s dive-bombed Japanese supply lines and strafed convoys in Burma. On the 27th of November, the largest force in China Air Task Force history struck the port city of Canton on the Pearl River Delta. But on the 19th of March, 1943, the small, scrappy China Air Task Force was replaced by a new organization, the 14th Air Force. Claire Chennault took command.
So naturally, the newcomers, the new guys on the block, attached themselves to the Flying Tiger name. After all, the same Claire Chennault was their commanding officer as well.
John Allison led some of the most successful raids of the entire war. But his Asian tour was coming to a close. He was to be reassigned to the European theater. But Allison tour was coming to a close. He was to be reassigned to the European theater. But on his last day in China, Allison would find himself in the most harrowing dogfight of his career. (31st of May, 1943). John Allison's last mission as a Flying Tiger in China. He was flying with a squadron of Chinese pilots.
One Chinese squadron had just gotten brand new P-40s, and General Shaw asked me if I would go up and fly with them. And I said I'd be delighted to do that.
Even before the Tigers arrived in China, Americans had been training and advising nationalist Chinese airmen.
I had 7 Chinese pilots, and I should have had 2 American wingmen, but one of them couldn't get his airplane started.
Allison and his Chinese wingmen escorted B-24s in a mission to attack a Japanese base at Yichang. The bombers, proud to be part of the Flying Tiger's legacy, had painted each B-24 nose with the famous shark's teeth. There was heavy cloud cover as the P-40 fighters and B-24 bombers reached the target at Yichang. Allison spotted a break in the clouds and went down to reconnoiter. He radioed the rest of the formation to stay above the clouds.
I said, let me go by myself. So I started, and I turned around, and I looked back, and I've got myself and my wingman, and then behind us are these 9 B-24s. And while we were having this conversation, all of a sudden, it's just as if someone had taken a handful of pepper and thrown it up through these black spots were busting through the ceiling.
20 Japanese Oscars had suddenly appeared, heading directly for the slower, more vulnerable B-24 bombers. Allison is here. The enemy Oscars climb towards the B-24s here. Allison must find some way to engage and divert the fighters from the bomber formation. He had to act quickly. The lighter and more agile Japanese fighters were closing fast on the B-24s. Allison jammed the stickback and applied right rudder into a climbing turn.
I found myself climbing with all these Japanese fighters.
He closed up on an easy target, an Oscar right in front of him.
Tracers hit his cockpit, and he just rolled over and dove straight into the clouds.
1 Oscar down, but 19 are still pressing the attack. He maneuvered through the enemy formation and lined up another Oscar in his sights.
I hit him, and he did catch fire. So I knew I got that one.
Allison pulled into a high G climb. He'd seen 3 Oscars attacking a B-24. But before he reached the bomber, he spotted another bandit at 3 o'clock. Allison had to make a split-second decision. Allison is here. The bombers are here. The Oscar is on his 3 o'clock here.
But I figured that I could just pull my airplane up almost into a stall, and then I might be able to divert these three from their attack on the bombers.
It's a brave move. Allison will climb vertically towards the Oscars, letting loose a stream of fire, hoping to disrupt their attack. But he'll lose airspeed in the climb. If he stalls, he'll be an easy target for the Oscar on his tail. Allison pulled the stick into his chest, almost immediately losing airspeed. He fired into the Oscars. His P-40 then shuddered into a stall. Behind him, the Oscar opened fire.
And the next thing I knew, I lost my rudder. This airplane coming up from below had hit the main hinge of our rudder, and it fell off. But instead of leaving the airplane, it was still connected by the cable, and it started a terrible vibration.
With his rudder gone, Allison can't really maneuver his aircraft. The only thing he can do is just keep it level and airborne. So he's now vulnerable to any other enemy aircraft out there that decides to take him out.
The P-40 vibrated uncontrollably as it leveled off. The Oscar rolled into position, lining up an easy kill. From 200 feet away, the Japanese plane fired. Pieces flew off Allison's fighter. The rugged P-40 had absorbed the hits, but it wouldn't stay in the air for much longer.
And I said, well, if somebody doesn't help me soon, this is it. I'm gone. All of a sudden, I'm absolutely enveloped in a hail of tracers.
A Chinese fighter pilot had come to Allison's rescue, firing wildly behind the Oscar.
So it's tracers from 650s. And I'd seen them from one perspective. Now I was seeing them from another, and a fatal one. And I thought, he's going to kill us both.
But the Chinese P-40 hit the Oscar, which went down flaming. Barely hanging in the air, Allison turned for home, nursing his shredded warbird back to base. The B-24 successfully bombed the Japanese runways at Yichang. 5 enemy fighters were shot down. 1 Chinese P-40 was lost. John Allison left the Flying Tigers in May 1943, but returned to Asia only a few months later to help form the 1st Air Commandos with Philip Cochrane. The 1st Air Commandos supported the Allied effort in Burma and pioneered the use of gliders for long-range airdrops deep behind enemy lines. Tex Hill stayed in China until November 1944. He became a triple ace, downing 15 enemy aircraft. Claire Chennault led the 14th Air Force until 1945, when he retired. He stayed in the Far East after the war, assisting Chiang Kai-shek in his war against Chinese communists in the late 1940s. The Flying Tigers of the 23rd Fighter Group went on to become one of the most feared fighter groups of the Second World War. From 1942 until 1945, they destroyed over 1,000 Japanese aircraft. They sank 184 enemy merchant ships, destroyed 817 bridges, 1,225 locomotives, and killed nearly 60,000 Japanese troops. Their skill and aggression proudly continued the legacy of the original Flying Tigers, whose exploits became the stuff of legend. The shark-mouthed P-40s challenged the forces of tyranny with incredible ferocity. Raising the spirits of millions of Americans and Chinese in the darkest days of the Second World War.